Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Emily Cottrell. On behalf of everyone at NISTS, thank you so much for joining us today. If you've tuned in, you already know that the transfer population is a diverse group of students who deserve programs and services that have been intentionally designed to meet their distinct needs. You also know that our work in higher education is stronger when it's informed and supported by data. But whether you've been in the field for years or are just starting out, that word data may bring up some tough feelings. Maybe you know what you want to study, but you're having trouble actually accessing the numbers and information you need. Or perhaps you haven't had a math or statistics class in years, and you're doubting whether you have the skills you need to complete a thorough analysis. Or maybe you've got data and stories to tell, but you're not sure how to frame a narrative that will actually help bring others onto your understanding and help them get why supporting transfer is so important. Well, you're in the right place. For those who are new to NISTS, we are a professional development organization designed to help you get the skills you need to do good transfer work. At NISTS, we equip professionals, faculty, and administrators to be transfer champions, agents, connectors, and advocates who partner together to challenge inequitable systems and design inclusive transfer student experiences. We're going to get started today, and I want to give just a few little notes to set the context for our conversation before I turn it over to our speakers. But just so you know, today we will speak for about 30 minutes on our new data guide, and then we'll save 20 minutes for questions and answers at the end. If you have questions, you can use the little QA box at the bottom to put those in, and we've enabled the upvote option so that if you see a question in there you really want us to address, you can put it up at the top so it's sure to catch our attention. We are recording the webinar today, so if you will check your inbox in the next week or so, we'll send you along the recording and handouts so that you can have that to keep for your records and share with others on your campus. But today, as you know, we're here to talk about this brand new NISTS guide, Using Data in Our Work with Transfer Students by Drs. Kristin Moser and Kristin Woods. And so I'm going to turn it over to them, and I just want to share with you a couple things. The guide is out and available. So I will put in the chat a link directly to that publication if you haven't gotten it yet. It is meant as a bit of a follow-up to a publication we did several years back, our beginner's guide to gathering transfer student data. So watch for those links here in just a second, and you'll be able to get it if you haven't already gotten your copy. But that's enough for me. I want to turn it over to our panelists today and let them get started with the content about data. It's a scary word, but don't worry, we're going to break it down and tell you what you need to know right now. So welcome again, everyone, and let's get going.
So thank you for the great introduction, Emily, and I'm really excited to be here today. So thank you all for joining us. Welcome. So we have so many different types of individuals and institutions represented in our participant list today, and it's really exciting to see how many people across the country, actually in Canada as well, so across internationally, are really thinking about our transfer students and how we can better serve our students and help them succeed. We have people from public and private institutions. We have people from 4-year and 2-year institutions. We have many other external organizations who are attending. So just want to say thank you and just welcome you all. A couple of things before we get started. So what we did is, as we looked through how we want to do this presentation today, is we have really set up our presentation today based on how the data guide is set up. So if you haven't looked at it yet, or if you're waiting, I would encourage you to open it and have that open as we go through. What we're doing is we're really wanting to make sure that we have the data guide front and center in our conversation today. It was newly released, as Emily mentioned. However, we are open to ongoing questions. So today is just the start. As we move forward, as you move forward with this information at your own institutions, please make sure that you don't hesitate to contact the staff at NISTS. Don't hesitate to contact Kristin or myself if you run into questions and you want some additional support. So we're really in this exciting phase where we're beginning this conversation, and we're happy to have you join us. Wanted to just give a shout out to Janet, Marling, and the entire team at NISTS for this opportunity. Janet mentioned in the chat that this has been a labor of love, but we have been working on this for quite some time. So it's really exciting to be here in this moment and to be sharing it with all of you today. Just brief introductions. Kristin and I are what we like to refer to ourselves as the Kristins on campus. We often get mistaken for one another. We work together on a lot of similar projects, so the mistakes happen. We understand that. But just to give you a little bit of background, I am essentially our institutional research director. I've got a fancy title, but I work in our Office of Institutional Research. And Kristin, I don't know if you just want to give a brief hello.
Sure, it's great to be here with all of you. My work is in enrollment management and student success, so I work directly with admissions, financial aid and scholarships, student success and retention, and international engagement. And so spend a lot of time working with transfer students and our community college partners as well.
Great, thank you. So, several years ago, Kristin and I were really sort of sitting in your shoes as professionals on this campus. So we both work at the University of Northern Iowa. As we were doing our work, we were working on similar things, but really not in a coordinated effort in any way. And so now we're coming at you as co-chairs of our transfer council. We have several years where we've been engaging in this work. And so we hope that you can see yourselves in us and you can see, as you move forward with this work, how you might be able to achieve this on your campuses. So just a little bit of a case study from our own institution and our own experiences. So about 10 years ago, we engaged in the Foundations of Excellence transfer focus. And so this was part of some of our reaccreditation that was happening at the time, but really also a deep dive into how our transfer experience was on campus. That was a really transformational process for us and for our institution for a number of reasons. We really we're able to collaborate in ways that we hadn't before. So thinking about some of the cross-divisional collaborations that were developed from that process, I don't know that we had engaged in that work in that way before. So that was really exciting. And being able to address some of the misconceptions and dig into the data and understand what was happening with people across campus, faculty misconceptions about transfer preparedness, some of those stories that we were hearing across campus. It gave us an opportunity to sit down, dig into the data, and really think about what it meant for us as a campus. From that process, one of the recommendations was the formation of a transfer council. So Kristin and I co-chair the UNI Transfer Council. We are a group of people from across campus. We have faculty, we have staff, we have administrators, we have students, and we are all engaged in the important work of helping our transfer students succeed. We've really worked over the years to not only build understanding of transfer on our own campus, but really reach out and make sure we interact with our transfer sending institutions. So, we're going to be talking about our experiences, from the four-year institution, but I want to make sure that you all are aware that this guide is meant for anyone, regardless of where you're from. So don't let that, dissuade you as you're hearing me talk about my four-year experience. When I think about some of the work that we've done recently, I have a picture up here of our most recent publication from the Transfer Council, which is a community college relations study that we've done. And so we dug into the work and into the data on our own campus. One of the things that we found was that we don't have enough interaction with our community college partners. And so we've been very intentional as a council to get feedback from those community colleges where we have 75% of our transfer students coming from. We had surveys that we sent out, we had in-person focus groups, and we really sat down and just wanted to hear how were we doing as a four-year institution receiving their transfer students? What do we need to do to not only improve the experience for your students at our institution, but what can we do to help you better understand the students before they even come to our institution? So we did all sorts of data summarization. We looked at some thematization. We made sure that we set up a process to share data regularly. So you're at a community college and your students transfer, how you don't know if they succeed or how are they succeeding. So we share that data and we have that conversation. We've built some really great relationships with these individuals because of this work. So Emily hinted at this a little bit, but why this data guide? Why now? We know that as we are really kind of thinking about the work that we're doing, we obviously have a call to action for a number of reasons. We want to make sure we understand the unique needs of our transfer students, and again, support success. It's always about their success. And it's exciting for me, being a data person, being able to directly connect my work to their success in their lives. It makes all of our work meaningful when we can tie our work to these overarching goals. Again, I mentioned this, but we want to make sure that we have a common set of practices and understanding across institutions. So when we all get together, when we're all communicating, we can sort of talk the same lingo, if you will. We wanted to make sure that we design this for a wide number of people, from admissions staff to advisors to faculty, deans, directors, new professionals. And so it was exciting to see on the registration list for the webinar today that we have a great mix of all of those people. So we're so glad you're here. And finally, we really wanted to set this up to make sure that this was a reflective process for you all. This isn't a one and done thing. This is something that you're going to be continuously building upon, continuously growing and expanding as you dig in and you better understand the data on your campus. In addition, as you dig into that data, many people or institutions are finding that there's a lack of common definitions for transfer, maybe even across your own institutional systems, let alone, across states and across the nation and beyond. Thinking about some of the data sources and how do we get to that, and why is there so much focus on the first time in college, population, and how can we move beyond that? And so we're hoping to be able to answer some of that with this data guide as well. By following some of the standards and the expectations that we set out in the guide, we hope that we can work together to really build this case and really grow this understanding of transfer to really make meaningful change for some of these areas that we've addressed. So all of you sitting here in the webinar are very aware, I suspect anyway, of the specific issues that our transfer students face. So I'm not going to cover these in depth here, but really want to just highlight the fact that by really taking an intentional approach to your work, by using this guide, you can start to dig into some of these things. These are really high level things, but you just take bites and pieces. Emily said, don't be scared of the word data, but you just start small and you build into this larger understanding. And so we hope that we can get at some of the root of the barriers that we mentioned on this slide with the help of this data guide. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Kristin.
Thank you. Well, we're excited to walk with you through the framework of the guide in terms of how to bring transfer needs into focus and use data to support transfer on your campus. And the first step really is asking the right questions. That's the first step in gathering data to address the needs of your transfer students. Clearly identifying the questions you need to answer and determining how the answers to those questions will be used. When campus partners, including institutional research, see that the data they're helping you gather is being used to affect change, it tends to build trust and the likelihood they will continue to partner with you in the future. There were a range of questions and needs that many of you noted on your registration forms for the webinar. And often a good place to start is with learning more about who your transfer students are and how they're doing on your campus. We'll do our best to incorporate the questions that you noted throughout our presentation, but again, we look forward to also engaging with you in the Q&A at the end. So here are a few examples of where you might start. First, who are your transfer students? What is their demographic makeup? We started with these questions on our campus and found that our transfer population is more diverse and has a higher proportion of students of color, first-generation students, military and veteran students, and Pell eligible students than our direct from high school population. And this became really important as we started telling our transfer story within the context of our university's strategic plan, where diversity and inclusion was highlighted as our #1 supporting goal. We'll get back to the communication later, but again, a really important place to start. Second, where are your transfer students going for our 2-year colleagues? And where are your transfer students coming from for those of you from 4-year institutions? Knowing the top sending and institutions and feeder institutions is an important first step for lots of additional research and relationship building to come. And 3, what are your student outcomes, both overall and disaggregated by student group? Kristin will share more about disaggregation in a bit here. Knowing this will likely dispel some myths that may be lurking out there on your campus, and also gives you an opportunity to identify inequities that might exist or gaps that your campus community can address. You can take this a step further and take a look at outcomes for students from your top feeder institutions and share that data with those partners so you can work together to address any areas of concern. In addition to these examples, we have several additional examples of transfer-focused research question in the data guide, specifically pages 9 to 11, in areas including equity, retention, academic outcomes, transfer pathways, recruitment, and financial support that may be helpful as a place to start as well. So once you've identified your questions, reach out and talk with your institutional research office to see if they already have some of this information. Oftentimes, we try and answer questions that maybe are already being answered in another part of campus, but just we haven't received the information yet. So asking that question is important as well as you get started. All right, so jump to the next slide. Still in this area of data gathering, another way to identify a place to start with your research questions is by calling out some of the persistent myths about transfer or transfer-bound students on your campus. I'll share an example here that relates to questions a few of you submitted on the registration form. This is a view that some faculty or staff may hold about transfer students being academically underprepared or not doing well academically as other students. The term transfer shock was coined back in 1965 by John Hills, a researcher who examined the performance of transfer students between 1928 and 1963 in their first semester at receiving institutions. And he documented a drop in GPA during that first semester. And that term has really stuck in the minds of many over the years. Now, there have been a number of studies since that time that actually document an increase in GPA after transfer in many cases, a phenomenon that Jay and Nickens termed transfer ecstasy in a 1972 publication, but this term hasn't seemed to catch on quite as much. We'll see. So we addressed this question directly on our campus, this question of this myth related to transfer students being academically underprepared. And we did this by asking two specific questions. One, does transfer shock exist on our campus? And two, if this drop in GPA the first semester exists, is it unique to the transfer population? And in this example, institutional research colleagues will have the data that can help you answer these types of questions. So what we found is that transfer students do experience on average a drop in GPA after transfer, but that this is not unique to the transfer population. Students who enter the institution directly from high school experience an equivalent drop in GPA. National research helps add dimension to this information, pointing out that this temporary drop in GPA is a function of a broader academic, financial, social, and emotional adjustment process for all students who make a change from one institution to another. We cited a number of studies in the early part of the data guide, page 5, that connect with many of the questions you submitted as well, along with a reference list at the end of the guide, because often these national studies do help support and add dimension to the institutional data that you're gathering as you ask these questions. I'll also note that we have a Mythbuster section in Appendix C of the guide, and this lists a number of myths that we have heard ourselves about transfer or transfer-bound students, and also in talking with colleagues on other campuses. And under each myth, we've suggested approaches to how to address those particular topics through data. All right, so we've started with asking the right questions, identifying myths we want to address. The next step really is finding campus and community partners. As I referenced in that last example, once you've identified the questions you want to answer or the myths you want to bust, your next step is to identify who on campus or in the community might have qualitative or quantitative data to address those questions. For example, if you're interested in learning more about where your students are transferring from or transferring to, and what their top areas of academic interest are, a few partners you might consider are listed here on this slide. First, again, institutional research, they really can help with just about anything. Advising or admissions offices often have student survey data or caseload information that points to top areas of interest in top sending or receiving institutions. Career services colleagues we've worked with on projects, they often do destination studies that point to where or in what fields students are employed after graduation. And they can often disaggregate that data looking just at transfer students. And also, of course, your transfer sending or receiving partners have institutional data that they could share with you as well. So we'll jump to the next slide and just take a moment here to, if you have a minute here, just reflect on and write down your thoughts on the questions that we've just talked through. So I have 3 listed here on the screen. First, what are 1 or 2 questions that you have about the transfer or transfer bound population at your institution? Second, what are 1 or 2 of the myths that you have noticed on your campus and you want to bust related to transfer students? And what questions are those associated with? And then finally, who are the campus and community partners who might have qualitative or quantitative data relevant to your questions? So as you think through these on your own campus, I'll also note that we have sections that allow for this reflection after each section of the guide. So you're welcome to use that as a workbook of sorts as well, if that's helpful. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kristin.
Thank you. So now for the fun part. I'm the weird data person who thinks this is fun, but we get to the analyzing and interpreting data phase. And so throughout the guide, we sort of highlight 4 different areas where we want you to focus on. So really thinking about those transfer trends and what is that trend data that you're looking at, the disaggregation, like Kristin mentioned earlier, the use of comparison groups, and then finally benchmarking. So one of the questions that someone asked on the registration form was, where do I start? How do I even know where I begin? And so really what we recommend is to do a thorough analysis of the demographics of your students. That's the very first place to start. And again, Kristin mentioned working with your institutional research people. I promise we're not scary. I promise we would love to work with you. So if you haven't created a relationship with someone on that team at your institution, please make sure you do that. So that thorough understanding of the demographics is really what's going to help you for advocating for your transfer students across campus. So an example would be, let's say you're looking into the data and you're looking at your transfer student populations by major. This actually happened at our institution. So one of the majors was shocked to discover that about 75% of their students were actually transfer students. So they knew sort of anecdotally that this was true, but just to see that number there really had them start this internal conversation in their department about potentially making changes that will better reflect who their students are in the programs. Another example might be, as Kristin mentioned, that increased diversity brought about by transfer students. Some of you may be experiencing what we've experienced here as well, with that the transfer student group being much more diverse than our first time in college group. And so that's an area where, as you're advocating, as you're looking for funding sources, as you're trying to really grow the transfer focus on your institution, you could link some of that to some of your institutional goals and priorities to make sure that you're showing your administrators that you have specific pieces of information and programming that can directly impact some of your strategic priorities. Once you've done this demographic dive in, what I would suggest is really to start making some basic visualizations. And these are, the data visualizations that we have in the guide. They're just basic Excel sheets, and then Emily and her team made them look really fancy for us, but you don't need to have anything too fancy. You can do just a basic Excel sheet where you can start to look at some of those trends and those visualizations. So, and this is all fictional data, by the way, this is not real data, but looking at that chart with the blue bars, thinking about the proportion of multicultural students and just demonstrating how, that differs between your first-time freshmen and your first-time in college students and your transfer students. Another piece is, thinking about things like Pell eligibility. We know students who are Pell eligible tend to be much more focused on, the financial impact that causes some stressors in them as they try to persist and graduate. And so really understanding those needs as well. And so maybe you have a transfer population of 30%, but you see by visualizing like we've done here, that your Pell eligible students actually transfer makes up 60% of those students. So there's that disproportionate representation for transfer students in your Pell eligibility requirements that could potentially change how you do some of your work and your outreach. And I know I've said this and I'm going to keep saying it, collaborate with units across the institution. This work does not and should not be done in a silo. If you don't have the skills to make these charts, if you don't have the skills to analyze the data, don't be afraid to ask. I mean, this is really important, and your colleagues across campus will be, I hope anyway, they should be excited to engage in this work with you. So please, please, please collaborate across the institution. Another thing that we do, we have sort of our whole sample comparisons that I just talked about earlier. Sometimes that can mask performance and mask differences for certain segments of the population. And so the next step as you're doing your analysis is really doing this data disaggregation piece. It's really important to break down your data into smaller populations or components. So it gives us, this data disaggregation will give us sort of a more nuanced understanding of our student experience and really help us target outreach to specific groups with greater precision. So when we typically think about data disaggregation when it comes to race and ethnicity. However, there are many ways to do this with your transfer data, and we have a couple of examples here. One of the slide on the left of your screen is looking at graduation rates. And so they're doing a comparison of your graduation rates for transfer students compared to the first time in college students, and what do those look like. So on first glance, you look at this chart, you might see that overall, maybe transfer students are underperforming occasionally, but for the most part, they're doing just as well as their first time in college peers. However, when you disaggregate this data, and when you look at it across a different scope or a different lens, you might be able to find some areas where you can have direct impact and you can create programming for improvement. So let's take a look at these transfer students who are graduating, but let's split them out by the number of credits that they bring in. So in this example, we're looking at not only retention rates of our students, but we're looking at transfer graduation rates. And what we see is that those students who have an AA degree are outperforming their peers without that degree. And so what this might do is spur a conversation about students who are bringing in fewer credits than other students, and what type of outreach and what type of intervention could we potentially direct at these students to potentially improve and increase their graduation rates. Finally, one of the things that we talk about in the guide as far as your analysis, actually not finally, I have one more, but so we're looking at comparison groups. And so this is really important as you do this work. And this guide makes the assumption that you have some basic understanding of how to do this, but sometimes making these match samples again might require some collaboration and some additional outreach if you're not familiar with how to do this. But what we've seen as we've done this work is really how the use of match samples can disproportionately, I think, demonstrate the impact and demonstrate sort of the return on investment of some of our programs. So as an example, and we talk about this in the guide as well, if you look at, let's just say that you have your transfer students who come in, oftentimes you're tempted to look at these students in comparison to the juniors who are on campus because they're all really, they're in their third year of schooling. You want to make that assumption that, okay, we're comparing apples to apples, but the reality is you're not. So when you think about those juniors who are first time in college students who are there, they have already been through a lot of the challenges and the barriers that students face as they move through higher education. And so the fact that they're retained into their junior year is going to cause some differences in your samples as you're looking to compare your transfer students. So what we suggest doing is taking a subset of these students. So you have your transfer student group, you have your first time in college group, take a subset and let's match these students on a variety of characteristics. So let's bring in maybe things like GPA, their race, ethnicity, Pell eligibility, a number of other factors to make sure that you're looking at two student groups who we would consider to be identical. What this does is this builds confidence that you can then look at the effects of, say, an intervention that you're doing and see that you are confident in the result of the outcomes of that intervention under the study. You're confident that some of those intervening factors, some of those other things that could be impacting success have been controlled for by matching these samples. And at that point, you can say, hey, you know what, I really do have a good sense that because of my intervention, our transfer students do have a higher retention rate. The last piece now within analyzing and interpreting data is the importance of benchmarking. So benchmarking is critical as we work to build buy-in for a lot of our initiatives on campus. So you have this understanding of the data that you've pulled together, you've analyzed it, you know where you should focus your attention, but what benchmarking can do is really help you break down maybe some of those internal holdups that you're having on campus. Maybe there's some hesitation to provide money or funding for a project or an intervention that you're proposing. Benchmarking can help you really demonstrate that impact of your programs and of your resources by really helping you articulate the strengths of your program, but then also helping show areas that we need to do improvement on. So allowing you to have that conversation with those people, you know, with your director or with your supervisor, with senior leadership, whoever that might be, showing how your institution is doing compared to others. It's really going to help you better tell that story of your programming. And then also it helps you, you know, as you are, you know, moving sort of outside of the typical first time in college cohort model. You know, this is something that we saw across many of the questions that you all typed in is, you know, so much of this benchmarking, we're struggling because we're having a hard time finding some of these sources of data that focus on transfer students. The good news is we are seeing a greater focus on this work. You know, I list a few up here. IPEDS outcome measures is a positive change in some of our mandated federal reporting. Some other things like the Student Achievement Measure or the National Student Clearinghouse Data Partnership Program. But we still have a long way to go to getting transfer students to the level of our new freshmen when it comes to data. And so by all of us having this conversation, by you all asking these questions on your own campuses, by you digging into the data, by us having a common understanding of this, I think we can begin to elevate that work.
All right, and now we're going to move to communicating the data that you've gathered and analyzed. So now that you've asked the right questions, you've gathered and analyzed your data, you need to make sure you're clear on who the audience is and should be for sharing your transfer story. Where are there opportunities to share the transfer story, possibly starting with groups that you know will be receptive and eager to learn, and then progressing to others as you strengthen your message. So a few ideas to share in terms of how to move this data forward. If you have a transfer-focused committee or council on your campus, start with this group, and that could be both to share your initial findings and also to ask their help in sharing it with other groups on campus or in the community. So for example, if you've got faculty members on the committee and there are faculty audiences you really want to reach in different parts of campus, ask faculty members who are on your council to do that presenting for or with you, because sometimes faculty presenting to other faculty, for example, is better received. If you're dispelling transfer myths as part of this work, start with campus leadership groups that might begin to shift their thinking with this data in hand. Disaggregate your data as much as possible to pique the interest of your audiences. So for example, if you're interested in speaking to the College of Business, disaggregate your data to focus only on business transfer students if possible. And that can, you know, generate a lot of conversation and interest if you're able to say, we're going to come talk to you about your transfer students. So that can be done with any number of groups on campus, advising centers, other organizations, and really trying to focus in on the students they're working with. Consider creating a collaborative transfer-focused presentation with your college's Center for Teaching and Learning for faculty or other professional development office that would be interested in partnering with you and getting the word out broadly. We also encourage you to create a one-sheet overview of who your transfer students are for easy distribution. Make sure to incorporate profiles, both of transfer students who are having a great experience and doing well on your campus, and to faculty who were transfer students themselves. We've found through this process that there are many department heads, faculty members that we had no idea had experience as a transfer student themselves in their own journey. And so really working with those faculty to highlight in these materials, but also to help you share the story can be really useful. This infographic up on the screen is a template that you could use if you'd like to create that info sheet that really breaks down who your transfer students are in terms of various demographic characteristics. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when we asked some of those very initial questions about who our transfer students are, we made sure to highlight that here, and every opportunity would talk about how important our transfer student population is to our diversity goals here on campus in terms of military and veteran backgrounds, race and ethnicity, first generation status, and so on. And so that really, I think, helped our campus community understand even more the importance of our transfer student community. But there may be other formats you'd like to use, but we've now have this, we use a template very similar to this and just update the data every year. We include information about our community college partners in the state there on the second page, and then just update the data year to year. So that said, maybe we'll just pause here and ask for your questions, anything we haven't addressed or anything more specific that we can answer at this point.
Yeah, and I don't mind getting us started with some questions that I have. So Kristin, if you could stop sharing your screen if you want, we're just going to head into the sort of conversation section of the webinar now. So feel free, everyone, to put your questions as you have them in the QA box over there, and we'll take a look at those. But I do have a question. Maybe Kristin Moser, you might be the best one to address this one. But what would you say to folks who are concerned with asking the right question? How do they approach this mindset? I really need to know some stuff, but how do I know I'm asking the right stuff? And then I have a follow-up to that as well that you may want to touch on. You've mentioned a couple of times how important it is to have a relationship with your institutional effectiveness and institutional research offices. But what about campuses that don't have very large staff in IE or IR? Who should folks approach if that's not the case on their campus? So what are the right questions, and what if you don't have a big IR office?
Yes. So first and foremost, the right question. So don't worry about that at all. So I can't tell you how often in my office, and there are a couple of my teammates on this call, and I'm sure they can understand this as well, but we get asked questions all the time. And what we do is we sort of finesse it and we say, well, you're asking this, but I really think you might be wanting to get at this. And so don't worry about the question. Just ask the question of your data people. If you have them, they will help you finesse it, help you understand it from a perspective of your own institution and the data realities at your institution, and they'll be able to collaborate. It's a little bit more challenging if you don't have an IR team. And again, I can't stress that enough. If you don't know your IR person, if you do have a team, please make sure you reach out and get to know these people. But if you don't have an IR team, often you will have a few pockets where this work is happening. You might have someone in your registrar's office. You might have a faculty member. You might have someone who does this type of work and has this expertise. And so that's where, this creation of the Transfer Council can be so transformative, or a similar body, is you get like people together who bring in different skills to the conversation, and that can help you if you don't have a set IE office that you can reach out to.
As far as identifying the questions to ask, a couple of thoughts on that. One, Kristin mentioned at the beginning that we did sort of an externally guided self-study with Foundations of Excellence, which now is the Gardner Institute, and took a real systematic look at our transfer students' experiences. And that allowed us to identify a number of places where we could do better, and then created the Transfer Council to work through each of those. So that's one option, is to work with either an internal and external group to sort of guide you through a comprehensive look at what questions you need to address. The second is just by talking to your colleagues on campus, just to be really transparent. We had one sort of advisor on campus, we were hearing a lot about in terms of things this person was saying about transfer students in both public settings and to students themselves that were really were not true, first of all, and were very hurtful. And so we really focused some of our communication on that particular academic area and made sure to ask questions that dispelled the myths that this person was sharing. So that's another sort of way, to identify those real pain points, those problem areas, and to address them very specifically.
Thanks so much for those responses. And I want to add to your point, Kristin, about just going to people, Kristin M, to your point about just going to other folks on your campus who may have the expertise you need. I used to work at a small 2-year commuter campus, and I tell you, I had no qualms going to our statistics professor and being like, it's been a decade since I've had statistics, can you help me remember how to do some of these things? And he was more than willing to sit down and even grab some of those Excel charts with me to sort of map through some of the things that I was investigating and wanting to know. So never underestimate the power of those colleague relationships that you've been building in the break room or at your Christmas breakfasts or holiday luncheons or whatever you have. So definitely utilize those resources that you have available to you there. I have another question that we maybe want to talk about just a little bit. Something we get asked a lot at NISTS is, what data points are going to be the most powerful? Now, this is a little bit of a loaded question because we know the institutional context is real and so much just matters about how you are at your campus and in your geographic location. But are there particular data points that come to mind for you that might be some of the more powerful ones to begin to draw on and look at and dig into to help shift the pendulum, if we can say that, shifted away from that focus on first-time freshmen, where we know a majority of resources tend to be allocated, to get some of those resources towards our transfer population, whether that's through financial aid. So we're looking at Pell grants or scholarship or things of that nature. But what do we need to start looking at to start really helping colleagues understand we need to focus more and get more resources specifically to our transfer populations?
I'll maybe share a couple of thoughts, and I'm sure Kristin has more. So in our roles, we present more than annually, at least once a semester, broadly to campus leadership groups on our enrollment, our student enrollment. And we have really elevated what we share regarding transfer. Just on a really basic level, a lot of people on campus didn't realize that a third of our new student class every year are transfer students. Just that, caught a lot of people's attention. So sometimes it's starting with just really basic information and always sharing that as part of your presentations about students on campus. Second, we really took a look at what were the academic majors of our transfer students and which academic programs were seeing, many of their the students in their programs coming in as transfer students. So for example, we identified some majors where 75–80% of their students were coming in as transfer students. And so we were able to really go at the department and college level and say, transfer students are tremendously important to your college. If transfer students weren't here on campus, you would have a quarter of your enrollments, that type of thing. And that did help, I think, motivate some change in thinking about resource allocation, and even we saw some increase in the number of sort of recruitment trips that faculty were going on in some of those areas. So I think that's another way, identify specific colleges or departments where transfer students are a large proportion of their student population.
Yeah, those are great examples, Kristin. And so to add on that, a couple of ideas I had as Emily, you were asking your question, we talked about the career outcomes earlier. And so one of the things that we found as we dug into some of our career data is, so we're a regional comprehensive institution. Most of our students, and we serve the region and the state mainly. Many of our students who graduate from this institution stay in the state to live and work and grow the economy, right? But what we found is that 90% of our transfer students actually stay in state after they graduate from our institution. So telling that story with our president, telling that story when we go down to the state capitol and we advocate and we have our visit days down there, that really helped to really elevate the work that we're doing with transfer as well. And so using some of the outcome data is really important, I think.
I think that's such an excellent point, because any kind of relationships you have with your community should be based on community needs. And so looking at what those high draw fields are and make sure you've got a pipeline to get the students from the community college to your institution and then into those careers specifically. So that's such an important point. And it looks like, Kristin, you're starting to tackle the question in the box there, but do you want to address it? Just go ahead and address it live. Is that okay? Okay.
Sure, I'm glad to do that. So the question really is about, does the Transfer Council have actions they take or make recommendations to help improve transfer student experience? Or does the group do communication across campus about identifying who your transfer students are? So I would say both. So initially when the group was formed, we had a list of recommendations from that Gardner Institute transfer focus, that Foundations of Excellent study. And so as a group, we formed working groups and we systematically worked through each of those recommendations. And then now every few years we conduct a community college relations study that similar to the one Kristin referenced at the beginning, where we conduct focus groups on community college campuses. We send out surveys to our community college advisor and faculty colleagues. And we really work to identify what are the barriers to transfer, what could we do better to strengthen our relationship. And then we compile all of that information into themes and recommendations. And then the Transfer Council is responsible for working through those recommendations and addressing all of them. One of the very first recommendations after that very first study was had to do with the fact that there wasn't enough campus knowledge or awareness of our transfer student population. And so one of the very first things that the council did was to work with our university relations office to create the infographic with the template we shared, reporting out who our transfer students were at that time. And we continue to use that year to year. And that's just an ongoing now part of the work that we do. So again, it was one of the very first recommendations and now is sort of a standing task.
The only thing I would add to that, Kristin, is so as the Transfer Council looks at these recommendations, oftentimes we'll form some working groups, and sometimes that'll be based on the membership of the committee, but oftentimes we will actually bring in others from other areas. So we might bring in a community member, we might bring in someone from a community college, we might bring in a faculty member. And so what we're doing is really sort of building that understanding that Kristin is talking about through some of the work that we're doing as well. So that's been really effective for us as a council as we break into those working groups and tackle those recommendations.
Appreciate that so much. And so I put the link to National Transfer Student Week in the chat because it's tangentially related. I think for folks who are just starting to do that communication broadly with their campus community, National Transfer Student Week is a great time to partner with other offices on your campus who are maybe promoting National Transfer Student Week or doing programming for students. Connect with your IR office, get those data sheets, share that information during Transfer Week. That's already a thing and everybody's doing it nationally. Hashtag Transfer Student Week, look it up. And just pile on and start a trend, what's the word I'm looking for, where you do it consistently all the time, every year. And you've got a time when people are expecting and looking for that information, but you need an in. Transfer Student Week is a great time to begin, and you can invite other high-ranking officials to work with you on that as well to promote transfer students as an important population on your campus. Another thing I'll mention is that we often get questions about working with faculty, and I know you referenced it a little bit, Kristin, some of the myths that we often hear about transfers and how faculty maybe have absorbed those, not really knowing that they weren't true. So I'm putting in the chat as well, just a plug to another one of our resources, our faculty practices guide. It's a great tool that if you're starting to hear things from faculty, you can partner with your teaching and learning center or maybe your cabinet, your provost's office to circulate documents like this with department chairs and things like that, that they can then get out to their departments and the faculty there talking about transfer and why it's important. But the very first principle we talk about in there is challenging deficit mindsets. And that can be such an important kind of eye-opening conversation for faculty to have. And so using your data in combination with other resources like this can be really powerful tools as you're going to these departments to talk about, hey, did you know that you have 90% of your students are transfer students? I think some of these things can help. We have another question in the chat there. Oh, Kristin, go ahead. Do you want to add?
I was just going to say that another kind of standing recommendation that we're always working on has to do with faculty to faculty connections. We're always hearing from our partners that, you know, there's interest in more and more relationship building between community college and university faculty. And so that's something, again, we continue to work on in the form of, you know, sort of gatherings by academic area, visits to community college campuses with faculty in identified areas and so on. So that's always a really exciting opportunity, and it always leads to new transfer pathways, new relationships. So just something else that has been I think, great opportunity.
And it also helps get at maybe some of those myths on your campus that your transfer students aren't prepared. And so we push that back on our faculty and say, well, that's on you then. You need to meet with your community college partners and work on those learning outcomes to make sure that the students who take your intro class at the community college are going to be prepared to take your class when they get here. And so we've really, sort of changed that narrative as we've expanded our academic assessment and student learning outcome assessment as well.
And I wonder if don't want to put you on the spot too much here, but we hear a lot about persistence, retention, and graduation rates. And those are often the data points that everybody wants to point to as it. But what are some other sort of creative data points you would encourage folks to look at? Because those are what we call kind of lag measures, right? Like you don't know them until they're already done, like the students are already gone and finished. So what are perhaps some creative data points you would recommend folks start to look at as they're trying to understand, are our transfer students engaged? Are they accessing services? What could we start to get on folks' radars besides that all important RPG?
Well, first of all, I would jump in and say that retention and graduation question was really important to us in terms of dispelling myths. So we did highlight that on our info sheet just to say transfer students are retained and graduate at levels similar to or equal to those of students who enter as directly from high school. So we do highlight that and disaggregate to identify any inequities that we can address. But I had another thought and I'm losing it. But Kristin, why don't you jump in and it'll come back?
Yeah, well, so, what I would do is I would push back and really talk about just sort of a broad understanding on your campuses of the factors that impact student success. And so some of these other things that sometimes people don't recognize have an impact on those big items like persistence and retention and graduation, that engagement piece, some of the things that we know are difficult for transfer students to do. Many of them are working, many of them have families, and so it's hard to be engaged on campus at a level that our first time in college students can. And so just making sure people, especially faculty, understand that intersection of someone's academic life with their personal life, and really kind of thinking about the student as a whole person. That's the data that we like to look at and we like to share.
It came back to me. So the other maybe approach that you might consider is really working with your colleagues across divisions on your campus to again disaggregate. So for example, we worked with our staff who work with Welcome Week programs, new student programs, to make sure that they do swipe data. So students swipe their cards or have their cards scanned to identify who's attending. And so we are disaggregating that to see, okay, what proportion of our new transfer students are attending events. And that information was helpful to us in knowing that we needed to expand our transfer track or transfer specific programming during those Welcome Week events. Also career services, like I said, we'd always just looked at our first destination survey broadly, but career services is very receptive to saying, let's look at how transfer students are doing specifically. So those are a couple of data points that you might consider.
I love all of those examples, and I think you're dead on with the swiping. That's what came to my mind too. So campuses that have that capability, I think everybody's swiping everything. So it's not just events, but like, are you coming into advising? Are you coming into the library? Are you coming into the dining hall? There's so many ways you begin to track and understand not just the volume, the literal number, but also times of day. And so to your point, Kristin, these students are often working. sometimes full-time and managing families and other caregiving responsibilities. And so tracking whether services are available for those students at peak times when transfers need them can be a really eye-opening experience to do too. So
Just
here
a
we are.
caveat
Here
to
ready
that.
to-
Can I just say one caveat to that? So don't collect the data if you're not going to use it. So have a plan. I had a group that came to me with like 25 years of swipe data, and that was a little bit of a challenge. So just please have a plan first. I agree with swiping, but make sure you're going to use it before you collect all of it. That's my plug. I will stop.
That point though about all of the data, we know that that's so critically important. Don't track it just for tracking's sake, like have a point to what you're looking for. So that's a really great note to end on. We're here at the end of the hour. I want to thank everyone for attending. Obviously, thank you to our panelists and for your work on the guide and getting it out in the world. We're really eager to hear how folks are using the guide, but tracking data on their campuses. There's so much great information in there. And so let us know. Drop a line to nists@ung.edu and we'll take a look at that feedback, and we would love to have it. Kristin and Kristin, thank you for your time and thanks for the guide. And everyone, thanks for the wonderful questions. Keep them coming and keep up that great work with your transfer students and transfer data. I hope everyone has a marvelous rest of their day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Today.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch next week with the recording. So thank you so much, everyone. Stay tuned. Bye-bye.